We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour.
We gather this hour as people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
As people of faith.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
With joys and sorrows.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
Gifts and needs.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
We light this beacon of hope.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
Sign of our quest for truth and meaning.
In celebration.
In celebration.
In celebration.
Of the life we share together.
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 We share together.
We share together.
We share together.
Yes.
So, as I am absolutely certain that you all remember your high school physics classes or class, do you? Okay, good. Where we learned Newton's first law of motion, which states that an object at rest will remain at rest, and an object in motion will remain in motion unless it's acted upon by a net external force. Of course, you remember that. And the basic idea is, so when I throw a ball, the first law of motion says it will continue to fly through the air forever unless some other force or forces act upon it. And on Earth, of course, we have gravity pulling the ball down, or more accurately, pulling it toward the center of the Earth. And we also have air resistance that's sort of pushing against the ball. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we have a person with their hand out stopping the ball. And that combination of forces makes it possible to play catch, right? And because of our experiences living on this planet, we have developed a kind of deep intuition about Newton's first law of motion. It's really just how we go about our day. We don't really have to think about Newton's physical mechanics to understand how to play catch. And we also experience, now there's another force, one of these forces that can act on the ball or whatever else is going on that's in motion. And we experience it as friction. And friction, as again, you remember from your physics classes, the resistance of one surface or an object encounters when moving over another, or perhaps through another. So when I throw the ball, the air resistance serves as a kind of friction. And that's a resistance, right? Or when I roll the ball, the surface of the floor serves as a frictional resistance. When I push the brake pedal on my car, it activates the brake pads against the rotors on the wheels, and that causes friction and slows the car down. It's also being slowed down by the friction between the roadway and the tires. So we have a pretty good sense of where friction shows up in our physical lives. And we've experienced these varieties of friction. We notice that smoother surfaces tend to have less friction than rougher surfaces, which is why, of course, driving on icy roads is a little bit more dangerous than driving on dry roads, right? And we learn that when we lubricate the surfaces with something, there's less friction. If we put a little oil on a surface, there's less friction, and things go smoothly. Now, one of the qualities of friction that I want you to remember is that it generates heat energy. And we get that when we rub our hands together like that, we can start to feel the heat in our fingers and our hands. And depending on the context, that heat can be quite welcome. Now, while I've never been successful at doing so, I know it's possible to create enough frictional heat with a couple of sticks to create a fire, which is good if a fire is what you're wanting. I have seen, however, when the brakes of a car have generated so much frictional heat that they catch fire, which wasn't good. And that fire was definitely unwanted and very destructive. And of course, today, I, as your minister, do not really want to talk about the physics of friction. I'm much more interested today in the physics of your relationships. And when I talk about your relationships, I'm mainly interested in what I call the big four of your relationships. And that's the relationship with yourself, your relationships with other people, your relationship with this earth, and your relationship with God, however you understand that term. Objects in motion remain in motion. I think most of us seek to live lives of low resistance. Yeah. We seek relationships that offer some ease, where we can continue moving through our life without much difficulty. We just want to be, right? We just want to be that kind of being in which is sort of this idealized existence that allows us to live as if we were an object thrown into the vacuum of space, forever in motion and unaffected by any external forces. But of course, we don't live in that lonely vacuum of space. We live on a fragile planet. We live with other people. And we live with the idiosyncrasies of our own minds and souls. We live with friction. Last week, those of you who joined us know that I talked about 4 different narratives of America, in which in those 4 narratives, we can definitely feel, we can sense the friction. For example, the heat generated with the narrative of what we called free America. This is the narrative of the individualist libertarianism, right, in America, runs up against the narrative of just America, which is a story about redressing systemic injustice. And those 2 narratives can push up against each other, going in opposite directions. And we know that, we can feel the heat from that. And because I've spoken with many of you who have friends or relatives whose political viewpoints are the antithesis of your own, and you don't know how to resolve those differences or even be in the same room as those folks. When they post on social media or copy you on that email or loudly proclaim their opinion at the family cookout, you feel the heat rising in you. That heat might be pointing to friction. Or perhaps the locus of your friction is much more internal, more deep in your heart, not external like the friction you feel in your relationships with other people, but perhaps it's more internalized. We feel the heat that rises in our hearts when we discern that the life that we're living is not truly aligned with the life that wants to live through you. That the life we're living isn't really aligned with the life that wants to live through you. That is a form of friction. Or perhaps you, like so many of us, see and understand the fragility of this planet and humankind's apparent ambivalence to that fragility. And you feel sometimes literally the heat of climate change. And you find that your own efforts to mitigate the damage feel far too small, too minuscule to make a difference. And that, in those small, minuscule efforts against the massive problem of climate change, creates friction. Or perhaps you are like me and find a sort of spiritual friction that comes somewhere within a lifelong argument with God, an argument you don't want, you don't need, and yet still won't let you go. And there's another place of friction in our lives. And in these examples I've offered you, our sense is that friction is something negative, something bad, something to get over or go past so we can return to that feeling of ease and comfort in our lives. But I'd like to offer that perhaps friction is not a negative thing. Perhaps it is there in order that we slow ourselves down. Perhaps the apparent efficiency of sustaining our forward movement does not actually serve us well. For it is when we slow down, when we are able to listen more deeply, when we are able to find our mutual connections more easily, we might even find ways of moving together rather than in opposite directions. Elie Wiesel wrote, "The opposite of love is not hate, it is indifference." But a colleague once offered me what I found to be an even more provocative claim. He said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's efficiency." Efficiency is the opposite of love. Efficiency is living a frictionless life. But the efficient life, the frictionless life, is not a life of love, the life that comes from love, the life that lives through love. The friction we encounter in our lives, these things that slow our momentum, slow our acceleration from one moment to the next, are the very things that call us into love. A love that says, I choose you, my friend, my enemy, my stranger, my kin, despite all the reasons not to. A love that says, I choose my true self in all of its glory, despite all of the reasons not to. A love that calls you to hold fast to the interconnected web of all life. A love that calls you to seek your place in God. So I invite you today and in these days to come to notice the friction in your life. You can just pick any of those relationships, be that relationship with yourself or with other people, with this earth or God. Find a moment when you're just kind of moving along, but then you feel that heat building. You feel yourself being slowed down. And the key is to feel the heat before it becomes unbearable, before it becomes an inferno. And then slow down. Know that the friction is reminding you that love is not efficient, it's not easy, it is not without resistance. Slow down, my friend. Listen for what the friction is teaching you, how it is connecting you more deeply to this, our life. Amen. And I love you, and may we live in blessing.